It's a beautiful Saturday. Hope it's all going well for you. Today we'll be discussing Greece, the Greeks, and their predecessors. Um, Greece is a kind of the tip of the Balkan Peninsula, if you even want to consider it a peninsula at all. Got tons of islands kind of around the area. It has the Tyrrhenian Sea to the west, and it has the Aegean Sea to the east. The part of Asia, or Asiatic Turkey, beyond the Aegean is called Anatolia. The coastal part is specifically called Ionia, with kind of the southwestern part of Anatolia being called Caria. I know they have Turkish names. I don't know them, unfortunately. So I'm just going to be using the classical names. Further north, you have kind of towards the top part of Greece, you have Macedonia, which is split between northern Macedonia as well as the Greek region of Macedonia. To the east, you have Thrace, which is part of Turkey, the European part of Turkey. Even though parts of it are part of Greece and Bulgaria as well. To the west, kind of the northwest of Greece, the south of Albania, you have Epirus. And then, going further back, kind of the very bottom of the Greek peninsula, you have the Peloponnesus. And then, to the east, you have kind of a little minor peninsula where the city of Athens is on, and that's Attica. I should probably post a map, honestly. So all those regions, they're well known because the classical Greeks, they have tons of stuff that was recorded. For whatever reason, their history was unusually well recorded, and they just liked writing a lot of things down. So we know a lot more about them than we do peoples of similar ancientness. Like for instance, the ancient Germans, we barely know anything about. So much of it comes from Tacitus and his, very limited, and, probably wrong in a lot of cases, records. But, for the Greeks, we have a bunch of different records. So it really helps with researching. On top of that, we also have archaeology. There's been a number of sites that have been found on both sides of the Aegean, as well as, what are presumably the ancestors of the Greeks on the Eurasian steppe and what's now southern Russia and eastern Ukraine. There's also some stuff all the way, a lot of, like many Europeans and Middle Easterners, many ancestors of the Europeans are specifically from kind of central or eastern Anatolia, where a group of hunter-gatherers, the Anatolian hunter-gatherers, went and discovered farming. And with that, they had this population boom that led them to expand more or less in every direction, to the south, to the east, and to the west. Now, their expansion to the west is the one that primarily concerns us today. They reached Crete, actually, the island of Crete. That's just the south of Greece, part of Greece, actually, today, about 7,000 BC. And that was kind of their first known penetration into the European continent from Asia. They, at the time, some of them had actually regressed from agriculture to hunting and gathering. There were some arguments that had shown that the local hunter-gatherers in Greece had, were more sophisticated and were gradually adopting kind of the agricultural toolkit. This, however, was proven false with some DNA testing. It was definitely these Anatolian farmers who had kind of temporarily regressed or, adopted new methods of, collecting food, fish, that kind of thing, so that they could live on Crete and the islands, kind of bridging Anatolia to Greece. So by 6500 BC, they've colonized a lot of Greece, and similarly, to the east, 6500 BC, that's really when they start mixing with their neighbors to the south and to the east in the Zagros Mountains, as well as in the Levant. But those kind of mixtures, happened after they left for Europe. So finally, around 6200 BC, the kind of hunter-gatherer rulers of most of Europe were devastated by all these horrible catastrophes. Might have been a plague, that's my personal guess. But for sure, there are definitely major floods in the Danube River Basin, as well as the entire drowning of Doggerland, which was this massive land area in what's known as the North Sea that connected Britain with the European continent and got drowned in 1, 2, 3 tsunamis. That ranged pretty far inland. I think they reached up into the Scottish Highlands. So it's pretty devastating, and that's kind of when the Anatolian farmers, which we're now going to call the early European farmers, spread out from Greece to the rest of the continent. They ended up reaching Portugal by, I think, 5,500 or maybe it was 5,200 BC. They had dugout canoes, that kind of thing, so they could sail for limited distances, but they had to kind of leapfrog. They couldn't make long journeys at that point. So Greece, from a very early point on, kind of follows a separate path from the rest of the early European farmers. So the other early European farmers, northern branch, which expands into Hungary and Germany, parts of Poland, Ukraine, Romania, they're intensely xenophobic. They don't mix with the Western hunter-gatherers, the Eastern hunter-gatherers at all. Just did all sorts of stuff, like in the early 5th millennium BC, doing all this human sacrifice, had some sort of crisis, and were eventually overthrown in the 45th century. So they had their whole own thing going on in the north. The group that spread along the Mediterranean, the Cardio-Ware people, they mixed in with the Western hunter-gatherers. Probably wasn't particularly kind. There's definitely signs of violent conflict. But at the same time, they were definitely less xenophobic than the kind of northern branch, the early European farmers. So the early European farmers in Greece, however, they kept in touch with the peoples in Anatolia. And we know this because we actually have some DNA from, I think it was like 5,800 BC. So, within 400 years of kind of the early European farmers expanding into the rest of Europe, we start to see this Caucasian hunter-gatherer ancestry that's spreading into Greece in small amounts. So what had basically been happening is the early European farmers in Greece, they had not lost touch with their, cousins back in Anatolia, and they were part of, basically a cline where people are mixing with each other, deep into the Middle East. And that's a pattern that we see, for a lot of history. Greece was very much part of the Middle Eastern world for most of prehistory and not part of the European world. This is also seen most of Europe, with the exception of Greece and Slavonia. I should say most of kind of EEF Europe, that is. During the 45th century, you have these widespread crises where the local hunter-gatherers who had been pushed into kind of these marginal lands, or who lived in areas that were unsuitable for farming, managed to overthrow the early European farmer civilization everywhere outside of Greece and Slavonia. And they kind of set themselves up as the ruling classes everywhere and formed these synthetic cultures where you have kind of this mix of the Western hunter-gatherer and the EEF technology, and those kind of new synthetic cultures ended up being very successful, particularly at the end of the 5th millennium BC, all the way up until 3600 BC, when you have kind of a renewed, climactic issue that, results in a lot of these societies declining. In Greece, that was not the case. Greece actually, possibly related to the Uruk expansion out of Mesopotamia. The Uruks were, probably more populous actually than the historical Mesopotamian peoples that were more advanced. And they actually expanded, deep into Anatolia, possibly as far west as Ionia by the time that their expansion concluded towards the middle, maybe about 3500 BC or so. And what I think happened was that kind of their expansion set up a chain reaction that sent a number of refugees all the way into Greece. Since right around 4000 BC, we see there's this influx of, more of this kind of Caucasian hunter-gatherer ancestry. So by that point, the for kind of an 800-year period from roughly 4000 BC, maybe a little bit earlier. It could have been related to the 45th century cataclysm, but just reading more into it, I think it had more to do with the Uruk expansion from Mesopotamia, setting off this kind of chain reaction of peoples migrating everywhere. So you have this kind of influx of these more peoples from Anatolia, and since the peoples in Anatolia, they didn't have that. I'm sorry, can you guys hear me? Test. I'm going to guys request if you can hear me. Okay, cool, thanks. So when we see that the Greeks, they have this kind of rise in this Caucasian hunter-gatherer ancestry, the migration was actually a lot more than 10%. Since a lot of these peoples in Anatolia, there were maybe like 20, 25, 30% Caucasian hunter-gatherer ancestry. So perhaps like a third of the Greek population was replaced during this migration out of Anatolia. Around 4000 BC, give or take a couple of centuries. During that period, I think there was like a fortress that was burned around 4200 BC, if I want to remember. Of course, could have been related to intracine, fighting between different city-states or whatnot, or it could have been related to these, violent invaders from Anatolia. So again, that's just kind of a pattern we see. It's not invaders from Europe that are doing this. It's, part of these series of migrations, invasions, population mixtures that are part of the Middle East. And the Anatolian farmers, their kind of ancestry reached pretty far to the east. They were like deep into Central Asia, into Arabia, eventually a couple thousand years later that actually move into Ethiopia too, and a kind of different story. So it's kind of Greece, again, very much part of the Middle Eastern world from, pursuing a different path from the other early European farmer societies. So towards the middle of the fourth millennium, there's a bunch of changes. The sail was invented around 3300 BC. There's, signs of sailing. You start to see like these trade routes that connect the Black Sea to Egypt. You have the kind of Eastern EEF societies like the funnel beakers who, they're all the way up in like Denmark, Poland, Germany. And they're actually trading all the way with, peoples in what's nowadays like Circassia, like Sochi, Abkhazia, that whole area. So they're sailing across the Black Sea. You see amber from the Baltic that's making its way down to Egypt. So there's this whole kind of, world that's being built by trade connections, seafaring, possibly cultural influences too. The EEF societies of Northern Europe, they were really big on building megaliths everywhere. They're just kind of erecting giant stones and patterns. Stonehenge is a very famous example. It looks like that stuff was spreading across the Black Sea as well. I'm not sure if it reached Greece, but that's just kind of the world that it was in. And this is where two very interesting groups kind of come about. The first one is the Minoans. So around 3300 to 3200 BC, we see the arrival of these very different, distinctive archaeological cultures, one of which we know to be the Minoans arriving in Crete. And then one of them was the Cycladic culture, and then there's the early Helladic culture. And despite having the name early Helladic, all of these people genetically are very, very similar. They have much higher amount of Caucasian hunter-gatherer ancestry, CHG, about 25 to 30%, if I remember correctly. So major invasion. When you look at the peoples that this could have come from, like the best fit population is a group, I think there's 2 DNA samples from them. from the site of Ikiztepe, which is in kind of north-central Turkey on the Black Sea, and I think it's pretty close to the city of Sinop. I think it's still Sinop today. It's definitely Sinop, in the biblical and ancient Greek times. So what it looks like happened, and the city of Sinop, it actually has, I believe there's signs of like ropes and, kind of other stuff that you'd expect for sailing ships in that specific site. And there's a lot of stuff too at that site showing that there were kind of long distance trade contacts between Ikiztepe as well as the Eastern Balkans. And the Eastern Balkans at the time, it looks like they were ruled by, and this is very speculative, the culture in the Eastern Balkans, it's known to have a small amount of Indo-European ancestry. The peoples from the steppe, kind of the nomadic horsemen that terrorized, a lot of the Eastern European world. So they didn't have a lot of Indo-European ancestry, but they did have a number of, artifacts that were kind of typical of the Indo-European steppe peoples, like horse heads or something you find there. They had some other stuff. David Anthony talks about it. But anyhow, those kind of two peoples were in contact with each other. You have the people in Ikiztepe, and you have these, group that's at least influenced by the Indo-Europeans that's living in kind of the Eastern Balkans, modern, like the coast of Romania and Bulgaria, and to a lesser extent Ukraine, that's kind of hanging out there. Now, why is this important? So the most divergent Indo-European language that we know is Hittite. The Hittites are actually referenced in the Bible. They were a central Anatolian kingdom. They waged war with Egypt. They ruled parts of northern Syria as well, but mostly they're kind of based out of what's nowadays Eastern Turkey. And their language is clearly Indo-European. However, it's very, very divergent from the other Indo-European languages. It's so divergent that there's actually a number of people who go and they reject that it should be included in the Indo-European language family at all. And they believe it should be called Indo-Hittite instead. And whereas most of the Indo-European languages are believed to have split in kind of the 3000 to 2500 BC, Hittite is believed to have split as early as 4000 BC. And this actually lines up very perfectly with the archaeology of this Savarovo culture and kind of the other Indo-European influenced culture of the East Balkans. The Hittites, for the samples that we have, they don't show any kind of steppe ancestry, which would make sense, because if this kind of Indo-European, if this group that's kind of hanging out in the Eastern Balkans doesn't really have that much Indo-European ancestry in them by the time that, they reached over to kind of central Anatolia, they might have so little Indo-European ancestry that it just wouldn't appear. Anyhow, there's another site. It's called Kumtepe, very close to Troy, kind of northwestern Anatolia. And there's actually a woman from, I believe, 3200 BC that does show a small amount of Indo-European ancestry. It's very, very controversial. The woman was, kind of low resolution. They didn't get her DNA in the quality that they like, but she very well could have had a small amount of Indo-European ancestry. So what does this show? We see a cultural shift, major cultural shift, as well as a major genetic shift in Greece that's related to this group that's living in the Ikiztepe site in northern Anatolia. We see this Kumtepe site, which has a woman that appears to have a small amount of Indo-European ancestry, just like these, people in kind of the eastern part of the Balkans. And we have this development of this kind of seafaring technology, that's connecting all these different parts of the Eastern Mediterranean at the very least. So what does that mean? Well, at the same time, we also see there's state consolidation in Western Europe. The climate slightly improved for like a century or two, and you have like the construction of all these giant megaliths, showing that after kind of a 400-year long period of decline and kind of a cold, miserable, rainy weather, the early European farmers started to get their act together briefly before collapsing again, around 3000 BC. Although, that collapse might have had less to do with environment than the Indo-Europeans just murdering everyone. So going back, though, to the 33rd century BC, what it looks like happened and what I think happened is, you have this kind of development of international trade, and all of a sudden, certain groups start becoming a lot wealthier, a lot more powerful. A lot of these groups, they depended, sea trade's very unique in the ways that, for pre-modern states would benefit from it a lot more than, you'd imagine. Like, let's say you're the lord of a certain area. You could either, one, you have a port. In the port, you've got a nice harbor, easy for the sailors to kind of sail in, and they have an area that's kind of protecting them from the weather, the waves, all of that. And their boats are just sitting there. They're very vulnerable, and you can collect, tolls from them, taxes, tariffs, whatever you want to call it. Very, very easy way to get money, and, by collecting that stuff, you've got gifts that you can distribute to, your vassals, your allies, whatever, and, you can use that to do all sorts of stuff, including raise armies. The other thing, whereas guy who doesn't have a harbor, he's stuck collecting taxes from the peasants. Of course, they hate it when you take their food. You get a lot more uprisings. People are unhappy. Everyone hates taxes, and particularly in times of like starvation, you're going to have issues with peasant revolts or, just outright rebellions from the nobles who don't like being taxed. Because for us, taxes, we just have less money. For them, it was you starve to death and your whole family dies. So having access to kind of controlling the ports, having access to the sea trade, very, very important for these societies. And it, in my opinion, and my best guess, stimulated state formation and, the growth of more complex societies. Other cool things that sea trade can do, let's say your area has a famine, you can just go and sell some luxury products that you have, jewels, gems, stones, whatever. You can just sell them to your neighbor, the guy across the sea who didn't have a famine, and that way you don't starve, you're just a little bit poor. So it makes societies more robust as well. That's something that we see in the Bronze Age too, where you have this increase in population, particularly between 1500 and 1200 BC. That's kind of later. So what happened? You have the stimulation of all this trade, you have state formation, and part of the state formation was the people who develop the strongest fleets, strongest armies, the best trade, they expand massively. So that's what happened with the Minoans and their cousins. They looks like they launched a massive invasion of Greece between 3300 and 3200 BC, replaced maybe 40 to 75% of the population, depending. I think it was probably about 50 to 60 maybe, but I could be wrong. More DNA is always helpful. So massive invasion, clearly destroyed a lot of stuff and replaced the indigenous culture. Similarly, you have these people in the eastern part of the Balkans. They migrate across, and it's kind of the ancestors of the Hittites, as they're setting themselves up in Ionia, and at some point they eventually push themselves deep into Anatolia. Some of them, however, might have remained on the coast. Maybe that was the Trojans. So very, very interesting stuff going on. So the Minoans, they're a fairly advanced society. The Egyptians reference them as being skilled shipbuilders. And Thucydides actually kind of talks about, King Minos as well. King Minos, who the Minoans were named after, was confusingly not a Minoan. He was a Mycenaean Greek. I personally think he was a historical figure, but we'll get to him later. So we have the Minoans. They kind of set up their realm in Greece, and I should say Para-Minoans. You've got the Cycladics on the islands, and you've got the early Helladic cultures on kind of the mainland. So they kind of rule for a couple hundred years, and meanwhile to the north, you have all these convulsions going on. You have the rise of the Indo-Europeans. There's a plague. possibly, but they definitely found this massive copper mine that they used to, arm their terrible armies, and they go and they conquer a lot of like Poland, Germany, Scandinavia, just horrible stuff, devastating civilization. But Greece was spared at that point, as was, probably Albania, I think, Italy, France, Spain, at least for that initial invasion from like 3000 BC to 2800 BC. To the south, you've got the development of the Egyptian Old Kingdom. They've kind of consolidated a lot of their stuff. They have human sacrifice for the first dynasty, but kind of ditched that. Become a lot more civilized, and eventually become the wealthiest and strongest power in Western Eurasia. So they're an influence too. I think the Egyptians have records of contacts with the Minoans and the Greeks. And the Greeks actually, in their myths, it hasn't been vindicated by genetics yet. They talk about how some of them, like I think King Pelops, the guy who the Peloponnesus is named after, I think he was a Egyptian, if I remember correctly. So anyhow, a lot of stuff going on, between 3300 when the Minoans arrive and the Indo-European invasions were kind of wrecking all of Europe. So there's kind of a lull for a couple hundred years between, about 2800 BC, 2500 BC. The Indo-Europeans don't really do anything. And then they discover sea travel and start their kind of new wave of conquest. So during kind of the tail end of that conquest, there's actually another kind of apocalyptic event that affects basically everyone. The Indus River Valley civilization was affected, what's nowadays kind of Western India and Pakistan. The woolly mammoths were wiped out on Vrongal Island and, kind of far northeastern Siberia in the Arctic Sea. You have the, cousins of the Navajo who were living in kind of eastern Siberia back then, who were wiped out by the expanding, Eskimos and Yukagirs and those kind of peoples. In Egypt, there's the first intermediate period where their kind of civilization collapses for a while. All sorts of invasions going on in the Middle East. We have these migrants from kind of the southern part, like the mountains that are kind of the extension of the southern Caucasus, pour into Mesopotamia. So all sorts of stuff going on. The Minoans, largely endure it, but one particular group of Indo-Europeans, derived from specifically the catacomb culture, goes and invades, what's nowadays like Macedonia and kind of the northern part of Greece. We have some DNA from the Logkis site specifically, where there's a couple of the Proto-Greeks. They were almost certainly early Greek speakers. They're about 40% steppe or Indo-European in ancestry, and the rest of their ancestry was kind of a collection of the peoples they had picked up on their conquests. I don't think they had elevated Caucasian hunter-gatherer ancestry. So for a couple hundred years, they actually really didn't, mix with the locals that, boarded them to the south. Very much pastoralist people. Possible that the samples we have from them, which I think were from like 1800 and 1900 BC, were kind of nobles who didn't mix with the locals and kind of stayed separate. But anyhow, it didn't last. They would go and mix extensively with their kind of southern Minoan and para-Minoan subjects once they went and conquered them in the middle of the second millennium BC. So this is where we start getting more into the historical record. Thucydides and his history of the Peloponnesian War actually clearly had resources that went back 1,800 years. There's one reference he talks about a people called the Sicanians who lived in the island of Sicily. And he goes and he talks about how they're originally from Spain. That's actually been confirmed. There's two separate papers of, that discuss Sicilian samples, and the Sicilian, it looks like this group called the Sicanians, they migrated specifically from the eastern coast of Spain and settled in the island of Sicily in the southern part of Italy, specifically right around 2200 BC. Thucydides was writing about 400 AD. So he clearly had access to some very ancient sources. Possible. I guess it could be oral histories. Maybe some of the Athenian soldiers he knew, possibly himself. But I don't think he was at the siege of Syracuse. I think he was involved in fighting in Macedonia or on Thessalonica. Alexander's cartographer probably knows better than me. Anyhow, though, he had access to these very, very ancient sources, and he actually talks about how the Greeks formed. So the Greeks call themselves the Hellenists or Hellenists, and they, back in the second millennium BC, they didn't call themselves that. They had tribal names, and what he says happened is you had, in Homer's the Iliad actually has that too. There's some arguments over whether the Iliad, Eric Klein actually talks about it in his very, very good book, 1177 BC, the year civilization collapsed. The Iliad could have referenced a war between the Mycenaean Greeks on the Greek mainland, with this Suwa confederacy, possibly Indo-European, possibly not, on the western coast of Turkey and Ionia. Could have been as early, maybe as 1400 BC, could have been as late as 1200 BC, and associated with the Bronze Age collapse. Whatever it was, there were clearly wars between the peoples of the Suwa Confederacy and the ancestors of the Greeks. So Thucydides, he talks about how the Greeks, they didn't really have any national identity. They were divided into tribes, the Danans. There are a couple other ones that I can't remember. The Argeads, I think, were one of them. They're all in the Iliad, though. You can look them up there. And some of them are actually recorded as the sea peoples by the Egyptians. So you have, what's going on is you have this alliance structure that's kind of being built. So there's all these wars that are going on. And these Greek rulers, they're kind of intermarrying with the other rulers. They're setting themselves up as local ruling class in some areas. Other times, they're just kind of allies. And, these tribes, the Hellenist tribe, that's the one that ends up being kind of the supreme, tribe over all of them, that's kind of developing. It didn't necessarily have to be that way. Thucydides talks about King Minos, who took the island of Crete and united the islands. Presumably he's talking about the Cycladic Islands, the other islands of the Aegean. He, ended piracy, and he built this great navy. And that's something we see in the archaeological record as well. The Greeks, they do appear to start having colonies, I think as early as 1800 BC on the island of Sicily. But definitely by 1500 BC, which is around the time that King Minos lived, you start to seeing the Greek stuff pop up everywhere. There was definitely this Greek wave of overseas colonization before kind of the main, the classical era Greek colonization that we see. Why was this? So Greece has tons of islands. What I think happened is, for these different rulers, with their alliance structure and everything, to keep power, to maintain power, they had to keep in touch with, all these different islands, for trade, to collect their taxes, similar stuff like with the Athenians, the Delian League. The Athenians used their navy to kind of dictate beneficial trading concerns. And similarly, a lot of these cities for, they'd have ideological identities or ethnic identities that would align with the Athenians. They'd support them. I think there's something very, very similar for the kind of Mycenaean Greeks as well. And that's how they kind of, why they had this very proud seafaring tradition. I think it's actually very similar to, what happened in the Viking Age, as well as kind of the previous Viking ages in Northern Europe, where land routes were basically impossible due to geography and weather. And it forced people to spend a lot of time building boats and sailing around. So you have this large maritime tradition that kind of develops. And, for the Greeks, I think the same thing happened there. And seafaring, it makes you powerful. Like we talked about earlier, taxation from sea trade, that kind of thing, much easier for a state to control than for, kind of a traditional land power where you have to figure out ways to extract rents from your peasants and serfs and whatnot. So that's kind of the society the Greeks built. It doesn't appear to be particularly stable. Around the time of the Bronze Age collapse of 1200 BC, Thucydides, he goes, and there's actually signs archaeologically of popular revolutions. And, we see that kind of in the Y chromosomal haplogroup lineages as well. Like the Armenians, for instance, are very heavily in the male line that is descended from the steppe Indo-European groups. It's actually not like the R1A and R1B aren't particularly common in Greece. So it goes and it shows that a lot of the revolutions were successful. The kind of Greek rulers over a lot of these areas could be overthrown. And, even though they kind of remained in the Greek world and would eventually, speak the Greek language. Although some of them, like the Pelasgians most famously, they spoke their language deep into the historical period. I think Herodotus talks about them. So the Minoans, they'd been conquered, possibly by King Minos, possibly by someone else, between 1700 and 1500 BC. But the Egyptians still remembered them. Their words for kind of the northern sea trade people that they dealt with didn't change. So it looks like they considered the Greeks and the Minoans to be kind of a continuity of each other, which, to be fair, isn't like racially and genetically wise, isn't that absurd. The Mycenaean Greeks only left a very, very, kind of the original Greeks, I should say, only had a very small genetic impact on the, peoples of Greece, to the point that kind of the Mycenaean Greeks were maybe 5 to 10% Indo-European in ancestry, so we're maybe like 10 to 20%, if the original kind of log caste ruling class. So they did not leave much of a genetic impact, and it wasn't particularly dominant in the male line either. I think the other thing that's kind of noticeable, Greek mythology, you have kind of some of the Indo-European gods, Zeus most noticeably, the thunderer, who's very similar to Thor, or I think it's Varuna in Hinduism, who's the thunder god. Perun for the Slavs. You go and you see a lot of kind of the pre-Indo-European gods survive as well. I think Athena is one, Artemis, the Huntress, those kind of things. I know there's a theory that the Titans, kind of like the giants in Norse mythology, are kind of a myth reflecting the Indo-European conquerors subjugating the gods of their predecessors. There's arguments both ways. However, I think like kind of the mainstream view now, and again, I'm not a comparative mythology guy by any means, is that was kind of actually a Indo-European myth. You already have, even back for those steppe peoples, you already have the conflict between the old gods and the new gods, with the new gods triumphing and imprisoning the old gods. So there's that. So the Bronze Age collapsed, 1200 BC. There's droughts everywhere. You see the collapse of civilization basically everywhere. Some places worse than others. The Greeks actually go and forget their ancestors basically entirely. The old Mycenaean era fortresses that they build are completely forgotten. The Greek colonies abroad are totally forgotten as well. Like the Philistines, for instance, were one of the Greek sea peoples, described the Peliset, by the Egyptians. They get mixed in with the local Semitic population, famously fight their wars with the ancient Hebrews. And, eventually when the Babylonians come in, they finally are destroyed or disappear from history. But they do not keep up contacts with the Greeks. Even just a few decades after their arrival, all the Philistine samples are very heavily mixed in with the locals, and you can barely tell that they were Mycenaean Greek at all. I know one thing to be careful with the authors of the Philistine study, if you want to go back and reread that, they view kind of the very small amount of European indicative ancestry, like the Western hunter-gatherer ancestry that had gotten in, with the early Indo-Europeans when they were conquering the Baltic, before they went back to the steppe and then, kind of invaded the Balkans and Greece. They took that to mean that there was just very, very little European ancestry, which is true, but they just kind of, I guess the study, I think it was 2018, they didn't have access to the Minoan and Mycenaean samples, and they didn't realize just how little Indo-European ancestry the Mycenaeans did. There was one woman specifically in that study who I think was 100% Mycenaean Greek, whether born in Philistia, or whatever the Philistines called their realm, to two Greek parents, or she was a direct migrant from Greece herself. I think the Bible actually goes and it talks about how the Philistines were sent from Kaftor, which is probably Crete. That's what the Egyptians called it too. Though possibly Cyprus. And although I don't think the Cypriot results line up with, even though Cyprus was definitely invaded by the Mycenaeans, I don't think that, they definitely left a much smaller genetic impact there than, they did in Crete. So the Bible actually goes and it talks about how the Philistines were sent from Crete, or Kaftor, however you pronounce that, I'm not a linguist, to Philistia, just like the Hebrews were sent from Egypt to the Holy Land by God. So I thought that was kind of interesting as well, that the ancient Hebrews were kind of referencing the rights and the origins of the Philistines as well. Greek settlement in the Levant during the Sea Peoples period was pretty widespread. I think there was stuff all the way up the coast of Syria, where you have kind of Mycenaean pottery being made by locals. So there are probably a number of kind of fleeing, Greek colonists who are setting up kind of a Levantine empire hundreds of years before Alexander the Great goes and does the same thing. However, this was all totally forgotten. Due to all the revolutions and chaos in Greece, probably collapse of state capacity, the rise of a unified Hellenic identity, the Dorian invasions, whoever the Dorians were, they kind of lose contact. They forget how to write, even though I think it was either linear A or linear B, whichever one's Greek. Totally forgotten. They have no idea how to read it. It's not rediscovered until I think like 1948, I believe. So yeah, we were the first ones to read it for thousands of years. And then, similarly in Sicily, the kind of Greek colony there, Thucydides doesn't even mention it. He talks about, the later wave of colonization after the end of the Greek Dark Ages. Basically there's a horde of presumably Italic speakers related to the Romans who had mass immigrated from the Po River Valley due to a famine and overran the island of Sicily, and that's the Sicels. They didn't eradicate all the archaeological traces. There's, I think, a couple of Minoan sites around what's, nowadays, well, I think it's Syracuse, basically Syracuse area. So the Greeks really liked that location, and they went back a couple hundred years later, but had no idea that some of their relatives had been there before. So the Greeks enter the Classical Age, and that kind of genetic profile that we see of the late Mycenaeans, where they're only like 5% steppe in ancestry, we see that in the Classical Greeks as well, or at least one specific Greek, a Greek that we have in the city of Impures, which was a Greek colony in southeastern or eastern Spain. So we can tell from that the Greeks of the Classical era were very much the Greeks of the late Mycenaean era and hadn't changed at all. There are some kind of counter arguments that the early kind of log cast Greek samples that we see in northern Greece would be more representative. I'm kind of skeptical personally, again, doing to Thucydides, talking about all the different revolutions and everything. I think the Greeks were pretty thoroughly mixed. But again, we'll have to wait for more ancient DNA. Fortunately, it's kind of complicated because the Greeks were really big on cremating their remains. Unfortunately, they destroyed a lot of their stuff. So you can make the argument. I disagree with it personally, and I won't believe it until someone provides me stronger evidence that those kind of more Indo-European Greeks remained. So this is kind of interesting where the Persians, today they're about 20% Indo-European in ancestry, and kind of some of the groups in northwestern India, I think the Roars are like 45% Indo-European in ancestry. But kind of the groups that Alexander the Great were coming in contact with had considerably more Indo-European ancestry than the Greeks themselves. Khan actually talked about that in one of his tweets. He talked about how Alexander the Great invaded the Middle East and made it brown, which is a kind of funny way of putting it. Pigmentation, of course, wasn't as associated with ancestry back then as we think of it now. A lot of selection for skin color actually happened in the 3rd millennium BC, or really the 2nd millennium BC, sorry, like the 1000s and afterwards. Because a lot of like the early Indo-European conquerors of Europe, like in Spain, were kind of like a light to a medium brown color. Similar stuff in Central Asia and India as well. Even though some were, of course, fair-skinned, had blue eyes, whatnot. So, we should be kind of careful in applying modern racial categories to ancient races, since they were very, very different. So the Roman era, there's all sorts of changes. One kind of interesting thing, it hasn't really been published, but I know some of the guys who are working on like ancient intelligence research, they're kind of using modern polygenic intelligence scores and applying them to old DNA samples. I don't know how well it works, because part of the issue with the polygenic stuff is that it works best with populations that are known. So for groups like the Mycenaean Greeks that are pretty distinctive from kind of the modern Northern Europeans that dominate their data set, their predictions for intelligence with polygenic scores aren't going to be as accurate as they would be, if they're using like ancient Germans or whatnot. And even with ancient Germans, they're only like 80% the descendants of the, ancient Germans. So, there are issues, and of course there's issues with like the resolution of the ancient DNA samples, all of that. But they do have some preliminary results, and, from what I understand, they see that the more Caucasian hunter-gatherer ancestry you had in the classical era, the smarter you were. The kind of like Nordicist theory that attributes kind of the successes of the, basically says the Greeks, the Italians, the Aryans, all their successes were due to, this Nordic or, Indo-European ancestry. The results they have don't really support that. I think like one of the German guys in Sirmikum or whatever that area, the city, in Serbia that they did a bunch of DNA sampling from, I think they said like modern day he would have an IQ of 91 or something. So kind of like the northern peoples were pretty primitive, kind of stupid. And it's actually kind of the Eastern Mediterranean, Middle Eastern peoples that were presumably smarter. How true this is, I don't know. I don't think the results are that solid, but still worth something thinking about and considering. And I think it kind of lines up with what we'd expect given kind of the cultural and technological output of a lot of these places. Athens had a citizen population of something like 30,000. So, and those guys definitely punched well above their weight, in philosophy and engineering. Like Archimedes has the Archimedes screw, which is still being used today in some countries, as a kind of a piece of water infrastructure. Obviously, stuff we have now is a lot better, but for the time, it was very good. A lot of the stuff the Greeks did with mathematics, improving shipbuilding, that kind of stuff, definitely took a lot of brains. So the Greeks, they go, Alexander conquers the east. He actually follows unknowingly the path of, the sea peoples as he's kind of marching down the Levant, besieges Tyre, probably similar stuff to what the sea people did, sack cities, that kind of thing, build new ones. it's kind of a lot of interesting parallels there. And then, in another interesting parallel, just like the Italic-speaking Sicels overran the Greeks in Sicily, so too did the Romans, another Italic-speaking group, go and conquer Syracuse, pretty much in the exact same place that that Mycenaean Greek colony had been, 900 years earlier. Because I think the Greeks conquer it in the first Punic War. You guys can correct me. Maybe it's the Second War. Anyhow, the Romans conquer Syracuse. Of course, they go and they kill Archimedes. So same thing as what happened when the Sicels invaded, during the Bronze Age collapse. So the Greeks, they remain a sea people, very big and kind of like sending ships everywhere, very mercantile. The Athenians, they benefit from Roman rule. They no longer have to spend all their time like defending their colonies and, building an army. They can just trade peacefully under the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, and they do fairly well, actually, for a century or two. One of the things, we don't have kind of Roman era Greek DNA yet. What we've seen in the Balkans, to a lesser extent Britain, and definitely in Italy, is that there was kind of a large urban migration of peoples from the Levant and Anatolia who settled in the cities of the Roman Empire and predominated in its kind of ruling classes. Again, that's kind of what we would expect given the preliminary results from the polygenic intelligence stuff. If the people of the East are smarter, of course, they're going to take over the administration of the empire. Although, of course, network effects, ethnic cliques can't be excluded. That's something I'll leave for the, historians. I can't read, Greek or Latin, so I'm kind of useless for that. Let's see. What else do I want to? Oh, yeah. So the next big thing, Roman Empire falls. Population collapses by, a third, 2/3, maybe more, maybe less, depending on the area. Obviously the urban sites of Greece are affected too. I think like in the 6th century of Justinian, who speaks Latin, and by like the 7th and 8th century, everyone speaks Greek again. The rural peoples had taken over as the urban populations died off from plague and warfare. And just, cities where population sinks and always have been for all of history. There's this constant replenishment of blood from the countryside. Now it's due to high real estate prices. People can't afford kids, probably similar stuff back in the classical era. But disease was a much, much bigger reason. Even with, sewers and baths and everything, there's still tons of disease. People are shitting in the streets. You've got horses, cows, pigs, everything, all in very, very close quarters. There's all sorts of diseases that are being generated. People get sick and die. You have merchants coming from abroad that are spreading other stuff. It's just made for a very, sick urban world. So, the Roman Empire, you see the die-off of a lot of those, kind of Levantine and Anatolian populations all over Europe. Greece, I don't think, was any exception. However, there was a massive, massive population turnover in Greece in the Dark Ages. Now, the modern Greeks, the highest estimate that, you see for the ancestry of modern Greeks is that they're 70% the ancestry of the classical Greeks. I'm personally skeptical and think it was at most 50 and probably less. The Byzantines had all sorts of population exchanges, but most importantly, you have the Slavic invasion. The Avars were a group, very heterogeneous group actually, that included a number of peoples from Mongolia and from Siberia. And, they kind of took Europe by storm, ruled over what's modern-day Hungary, northern Serbia for a while. And, the great masses of the Avars were not Avars and people from the Far East like themselves, but Slavs. They had conquered all of these swamp-dwelling Slavs in the Ukraine, and they brought them with them. So the Slavs, they kind of poured into the Balkans during the Dark Ages. And the Byzantines talk about them. They say they, live in huts and in swamps, and they're very primitive. And, that's all probably true. And that, honestly, was the best lifestyle they could have had. in the Dark Ages. When you have this breakdown of the trade routes and political, social, cultural, technological complexities all breaking down, a very simple, very basic lifestyle is the one that's going to work the best. So all these Slavs, they pour down. Some of them reach into the Peloponnesus. Some of them become the Bulgarians. Some of them become the Serbs, the Croats, all those groups. And they pour into Greece as well. Interestingly, a lot of so basically the Slavs, they go and they replace, a third to half of the modern Greek ancestry, which has been, at least for the Greeks in Greece, it's kind of complicated by the fact that a lot of Greeks in Greece today are not actually from Greece. They're the Greeks from Anatolia that actually largely lack this kind of Slavic ancestry. So there's this kind of weird bifurcation for the Greek samples. If you look at them, there's some that actually have, that are like almost indistinguishable from Bulgarians in some cases. They're just these Hellenized Bulgarians. And then in some cases, they're basically just Anatolians who lack that Turkish ancestry that a lot of Turks have. And of course in Turkey, you see similar stuff, but there's actually some people that basically have no Turkish ancestry and they're like pure Caucasian or, more typical for, ancient Greek type stuff. So Slavic invasions were a really big deal during the Byzantine Empire's kind of reconsolidation in the 9th and 10th centuries. You see widespread Hellenization, where these kind of Slavic peoples are forcibly brought into the Greek fold. And, that's kind of the making of the modern Greeks, not the modern Anatolian Greeks. Modern Anatolian Greeks, of course, look like they pursued, very different paths, like the Pontic Greeks, for instance. Some of them are like indistinguishable from Georgians as far as I can tell. They're just mixing with like the Svens or whatever that kind of Kartvelian group is over there. So Greek, in a lot of ways was a, cultural term, in the Byzantine Empire and in the, kind of Alexander's period, where it included a very, very diverse group of peoples who were Hellenized. And that's kind of ending today with modern Greeks, where, the Anatolian Greeks and the Greeks and the Pontic Greeks are all kind of mixing together and, forming a new Greek people. So, that's what I have. I'll open it up for questions now. Thank you guys all for listening.